Imagine, for just a moment, that you are huddled in the mud of a battlefield. It's the spring of 1940. It's freezing cold.
Oh, and the air is just thick, right? Like you can taste the cordite and pulverized brick and burning diesel in the back of your throat.
Exactly. And the ground beneath you is literally vibrating. Somewhere out in the distance, Panzer tanks are rumbling forward.
Which is terrifying enough on its own.
Right, but then cutting through the air is probably the most terrifying sound of the 20th century, the MG-42 machine gun.
Oh yeah, that rhythmic mechanical ripping sound.
It sounds like canvas being violently torn apart. I mean, we're talking a weapon capable of firing up to 1,200 rounds a minute. That's like 20 bullets every single second.
So you are basically surrounded by the deadliest, most advanced killing technology the human race has ever invented up to that point.
Yeah, you're terrified. You look over to your commanding officer, waiting for orders, waiting for some kind of modern tactical brilliance to save you. And you see that he is holding a medieval broadsword and a longbow.
It's an image that fundamentally breaks your brain. It totally breaks the framework of how we understand modern history.
It really does. It's the absolute definition of an anachronism.
Right, because on one side of the battlefield, you have this mechanized, hyper-efficient slaughter of the Second World War. And on the other, you have a guy wielding weapons that were, frankly, outdated at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415.
It feels like a cinematic, mind-bending contrast, like something a screenwriter would dream up just to show how unhinged a character is.
Like a glitch in the Matrix or the historical record, yeah.
But we aren't talking about a movie. We are looking at a stack of incredibly real, meticulously documented sources. War records, commando dispatches, diaries.
The real deal.
Yep. And our mission for today's deep dive is to explore the unbelievable but entirely factual story of John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, better known to history as Mad Jack.
And to set the stakes for you, the listener, it's vital to understand what we're actually analyzing here. We're looking at a man who treated the deadliest conflict in human history like it was, I don't know, a grand old world adventure.
Yeah, like he's in a totally different reality.
Exactly. But as we explore his timeline today, we're going to see that this eccentric, fearless personality wasn't just some gimmick.
Right, it wasn't a PR stunt.
No, not at all. It was an incredibly potent, calculated psychological weapon. He used the sheer absurdity of his presence to basically dismantle the mental defenses of his enemies.
Okay, well, let's unpack this. Because to understand how a guy ends up charging Nazi machine gun nests with a Scottish broadsword, you can't just drop into the middle of World War II.
No, you have to understand the environment that forged him before the world caught fire.
So Jack Churchill was born in 1906 into this old Oxfordshire family, and he spent his early years growing up in British colonies like Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka, and Hong Kong.
Right. His father was an engineer and director of public works, I believe.
Yeah, so right from the start, he is a child of the empire. He's moving around, seeing the vastness of the world. And he eventually graduates from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1926.
A very prestigious start.
Very. And almost immediately, he gets deployed to Burma with the 2nd Battalion of the Manchester Regiment.
Which, in the 1920s, that sounds like it should be the start of this classic action-packed military career.
You would think so. But the reality of colonial garrison duty at that time was largely administrative.
It was incredibly static. And for a man with Churchill's specific temperament, that was agonizingly dull.
Oh, painfully dull. He's patrolling the Irrawaddy River by boat, checking up on villages. There's no grand battle to fight.
No crusade to lead.
Right. He's a man genetically built for high-stakes action, and he's trapped in a profoundly boring peacetime deployment.
And when a guy like Jack Churchill gets bored, he doesn't just, take up watercolor painting.
Definitely not.
He seeks out the absolute extremes of whatever environment he is stuck in. He had this innate need to test his own physical and psychological limits.
Yeah, if the world wasn't going to provide a war, he was going to manufacture his own adversity. And the way he does it is just spectacular.
What does he do?
Well, he decides he wants to take a road trip across Southeast Asia. But he doesn't hire a car or take a train. He buys a Zenith motorcycle.
Oh, boy.
And he undertakes a 1,500-mile solo ride from Rangoon to Pune, India, and back.
I mean, think about a 1920s motorcycle for a second. These are heavy, primitive machines.
Oh, they vibrate violently. The suspension is basically non-existent.
And they break down constantly. Plus, the infrastructure we take for granted today simply did not exist in Burma at that time.
Paved highways at all.
Right. Much of this journey involved traversing dense jungle, crossing river systems, navigating terrain that was never meant for a wheeled vehicle, let alone a heavy, unreliable motorcycle.
And here is the visual from the sources that just completely blows my mind. Because there were literally no roads connecting the town of Mamio to Rangoon, he decides the only logical path forward is to ride his motorcycle directly down the railway lines.
Wait, like on the actual tracks?
Yes, I want you to picture this. He is steering this heavy Zenith motorcycle by hand, balancing the rubber tires precariously on the metal rails, but he can't sit on the bike, right? So he is physically hopping alongside it,
Oh my God.
stepping from wooden crosstie to wooden crosstie.
Over open air?
Exactly. He is hopping over the bridges, spanning these massive, deep riverbeds. There is nothing between those wooden railway sleepers.
If his foot slips, he's a goner.
Yeah, if he slips or the tire slides off the rail, he and the bike are plunging hundreds of feet down into a rocky riverbed. And he does this for 500 miles.
That is just terrifying.
And just to add a little sherry on top of this punishing journey, while riding across the Indian subcontinent, he actually has a head-on collision with a water buffalo.
Are you kidding? A water buffalo is a massive, incredibly dense, and dangerous animal.
Huge.
Hitting one on a motorcycle in a remote area is usually fatal, or at least permanently crippling.
But he just brushes himself off.
Yeah, the fact that he survived the trip at all, brushed himself off, and returned to active duty is a testament to his sheer physical resilience.
It really is. But this period in Burma is crucial for another reason, right?
Absolutely. It's the incubation period of the Mad Jack persona. He's seeking out discipline, but not conventional hierarchical military discipline.
Right, he wants something else.
He's seeking out ancient, highly individualistic, solitary disciplines.
Like the bagpipes. While he's stationed in Mamio, he starts spending his free time with the Queen's own Cameron Highlanders. And he decides he absolutely needs to learn to play the bagpipes.
Now, Jack Churchill is an Englishman from Surrey. The bagpipes are a fiercely Scottish tradition.
Yeah, it's an incredibly odd obsession for a guy with his background, but he becomes utterly consumed by it. He's tutored by the pipe major, pouring hours into this martial instrument.
And it's important to understand the physicality of the bagpipes. They are not a delicate instrument.
Not at all.
They were historically utilized in Highland regiments for a very specific tactical purpose: to communicate orders across deafening battlefields and to intimidate the enemy.
They're so loud.
Incredibly loud and brash. And they require a tremendous amount of physical exertion and lung capacity to maintain the continuous pressure in the bag.
So by mastering the pipes, he's basically adopting the mantle of the ancient Celtic warrior.
Precisely. He is preparing himself to be a visible auditory focal point in combat.
But even with the motorcycle near-death experiences and the deafening bagpipe practice, the peacetime army is just moving too slowly for him.
It wasn't enough.
Right. It's like taking an action movie hero, a guy whose entire existence is predicated on dogging explosions, and trapping him in a slow-paced indie drama about office bureaucracy.
He had to invent his own danger just to feel alive.
And eventually, he just couldn't take it anymore. In 1936, after 10 years of service, he officially resigns his commission. He literally tells his commanding officer that he is simply too bored to continue.
Which is just such a flex. But he leaves the structured world of the military, and he certainly doesn't settle down into a quiet civilian life.
Well, not even close.
This interwar period is a fascinating study in his restless energy. He goes completely off the map of a traditional gentleman's career path.
He goes to Nairobi, Kenya, and works as a newspaper editor for a while.
Sure, why not?
And then, because he apparently has this incredibly chiseled, striking look, he works as a male model in magazine advertisement.
Naturally.
And then he leverages his archery skills to become a movie extra in massive Hollywood-style productions.
Oh, right, the archery.
Yeah, he appears in the silent epic The Thief of Baghdad to advise on archery and shoot arrows on camera. And he pulls the bow oar in the Oxford Shell in the movie A Yank at Oxford.
So he's just absorbing all these different highly theatrical, performative lives, trying on different versions of himself.
Yeah. But you brought up archery, which is the other crucial pillar of his development.
It's another ancient discipline he mastered to an elite world-class level.
People don't realize how hard war archery is.
Right, it requires immense focus, physical strength, specifically in the back and shoulder muscles, and a deep understanding of ballistics and wind.
It's totally self-reliant.
Exactly. You don't rely on a machine. The power comes entirely from your own body. And he became so incredibly proficient that he actually represented Great Britain at the 1939 World Archery Championships in Oslo.
He shoots for his country on the world stage. He's not just a guy shooting targets in his backyard. He is literally a world-class archer.
So let's just take inventory of who this man is on the eve of the most destructive conflict in human history.
Okay, let's see. You have a world-class archer, a master of the Scottish bagpipes, a former male model, a motorcycle daredevil who survives head-on collisions with livestock, and a highly trained infantry officer.
And then the calendar flips to September 1939. World War II breaks out.
And his reaction is incredibly telling. He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't view it with the dread that characterized much of the generation that remembered World War I.
No, he practically sprints back to the recruiting office. He happily re-enlists with the Manchester Regiment.
And the quote he gives about his return to the military is legendary. He stated he came back because the, quote, country having got into a jam in my absence.
I love that. He phrases it like he just stepped out of the room to grab a cup of tea, and while he was gone, Britain accidentally started a global world war.
It's amazing, but it reveals his fundamental perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. He viewed the war not as a geopolitical tragedy, but as a deeply personal invitation to finally do what he was born to do.
Yeah, he had spent his entire life preparing for extreme stress, mastering these arcane martial arts, and now history provided him with the ultimate stage.
He was ready to perform.
And he arrives on that stage completely dressed for the part. When Jack deploys to France in 1939 as part of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, he isn't just carrying a standard-issue Lee-Enfield rifle.
No, his combat loadout is something else.
It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. First, he carried his longbow and a quiver of arrow strapped across his chest.
And we should note, these weren't sporting arrows.
Right.
These were heavy war arrows, tipped with steel bodkins designed to penetrate medieval chainmail, being fired from a bow with a draw weight that would physically exhaust a normal man after just a few pulls.
Crazy. Second, he carried his bagpipes tucked safely under his arm. And finally, hanging heavily at his waist, was a sword.
Now, there is a common myth here that he carried a massive, two-handed Braveheart-style claymore.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but looking at the historical record, we need to clarify that. He actually carried a clay bag.
Okay, which is still terrifying, right?
Absolutely. A clay bag is a slightly smaller, one-handed, single-edged Scottish broadsword. It features a heavy, enclosed basket hilt to protect the wielder's hand during melee combat. It was the traditional full-dress sword for officers of the Highland regiments for hundreds of years. It weighed about 2.5 pounds, making it incredibly fast and much more practical for the frantic, close-quarters combat he fully intended to engage in.
And whenever anyone, whether it was a superior officer or bewildered private gut, questioned why a modern British officer in the 1940s was carrying a medieval broadsword against tanks and submachine guns, he had a very simple, completely deadpan answer.
What did he say?
He famously stated, "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed."
To modern ears, that sounds like a witty quip. But to Churchill, it was a deeply held ethos.
He actually meant it.
He did. He believed that an officer shouldn't just be a manager directing troops from a map room. An officer should be a highly visible symbol of martial prowess and aggression.
In a war where death usually came randomly from invisible artillery miles away, he wanted to make combat intensely personal again. He wanted the enemy to look him in the eye.
Well, he certainly got his wish in May of 1940.
Yeah, let's move to the fields of France. The German war machine, utilizing Blitzkrieg lightning war, has smashed through Belgium and France. The Allies are completely reeling.
The British and French had relied on the Dial Plan to halt the German advance, which basically involved moving their armies into Belgium. But the Germans outflanked them through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest, and the entire Allied strategy collapsed.
The situation was apocalyptic for the BEF. They are losing battle after battle, falling back in a desperate, highly chaotic fighting retreat towards the coast.
Ultimately aiming for the port of Dunkirk. And a fighting retreat is notoriously the most difficult and dangerous military maneuver to execute.
Because units become fragmented, right?
Yeah, exactly. Lines of communication break down, and the German advance, supported by terrifying Stuka dive bombers, is relentless.
And right in the absolute center of this nightmare, Jack Churchill is serving as the second in command of his infantry company. The original commander has already been injured, so Jack is running the show.
Okay, setting the scene.
We find him in the tiny French village of Lepenet. It's your classic European farming village stone walls, narrow dirt roads, small fields. Jack and two infantrymen from the Manchester Regiment are acting as a rear guard.
So their entire job is to sit in this village and buy time for the rest of their fragmented unit to fall back safely.
Yes. They are stationed up in a small wooden granary tower, looking out through a rough opening in the wall over the approaches to the village.
They are essentially acting as bait. They know the vanguard of the German army is coming down that road, and they are simply waiting for them.
And sure enough, approaching the village, completely unaware of what is waiting for them in that tower, is a small German patrol. 5 soldiers from the Wehrmacht.
Just 5 guys.
Yeah. They are moving cautiously, their Mauser rifles and submachine guns at the ready, scanning the stone buildings for snipers. From the granary loft about 30 yards away, Jack Churchill watches them through the gap in the wood.
And he doesn't reach for his Enfield rifle.
Nope. He stands up to his full height, he draws his longbow.
A weapon that had not been utilized by the British military in any serious capacity since the Tudor period.
He knocks an arrow onto the string. He looks at the 2 infantrymen beside him, who must be looking at him like he has lost his mind, and he whispers, "I'll shoot that first man with this arrow. Ready."
I want to break down the sheer physical and mental strength required in this exact moment.
Yeah, please do.
Drawing a 70 to 100-pound longbow requires the archer to recruit and stabilize muscles across their entire back, shoulders, and chest. It is a massive physical exertion.
And doing it quietly under pressure.
Exactly. To do it slowly, completely silently, while staring down enemy troops holding automatic weapons that can shred that wooden tower in seconds. It requires an absolute superhuman mastery of one's own nervous system.
So he takes his stance, he draws the bowstring all the way back to his cheek, he holds his breath, and he releases.
Wow.
The bowstring makes this heavy, violent thrum in the air. The heavy war arrow covers the 30 yards in a fraction of a second. The German sergeant leading the patrol barely has time to register a sound.
He doesn't even know what hit him.
He opens his mouth to shout a warning, and the arrow hits him center mass, right at the base of his neck, driving deep into his chest. He is dead before his knees hit the dirt.
Hold on to that specific historical fact. This is May 1940. We are in the era of mechanized armor and rapid-fire ballistics. And a modern combat soldier has just been killed by an English longbow.
It's wild to even think about.
It is widely considered by military historians to be the last recorded longbow kill in combat. It is a violent collision of centuries.
As soon as that arrow hits, absolute chaos erupts. The 2 British infantrymen in the tower open up with their machine guns. The surviving Germans dive for the ditches, frantically returning fire, completely pinned down.
The sound must have been deafening in that little tower.
It was. But Jack Churchill doesn't stay in the loft to shoot arrows. He draws his clay-bag broadsword. He runs down the ladder to the bottom of the tower, gathers a small group of his men, and he sprints forward into the absolute thick of the fighting.
He is immediately exploiting the shock effect he just created. The Germans are pinned down, confused, taking heavy fire from an elevated position. And suddenly, while they're trying to process where the sniper fire is coming from, a man wielding a sword is vaulting a low stone wall right into their midst.
He leaps over the wall, landing squarely in the press of the enemy. He swings the heavy, basket-hilted broadsword, felling German soldiers before their brains even register what they are looking at.
It's unbelievable.
He has the sword in his right hand, slashing and parrying, and a Webley revolver in his left, shooting at point-blank range. Within moments, the remaining Germans are so overwhelmed they shout and raise a white flag. They surrendered to a man who just charged them with a medieval sword.
It really worked.
It did. But I have to stop and push back here. From a tactical standpoint, wasn't a bow and arrow, and a sword for that matter, a massive liability against machine guns. I mean, if he missed that first arrow shot, the Germans would have just turned their automatic weapons on that wooden tower and shredded it to splinters. Why take that insane risk?
Tactically, purely on paper, yes, it was a massive liability. The rate of fire, accuracy, and range of a Lee Enfield rifle are vastly superior to a longbow.
Obviously.
But you have to factor in the profound psychological reality of the battlefield. The Germans were trained extensively to react to bullets. They knew exactly what a muzzle flash looked like. They recognized the supersonic crack of a rifle round.
It's muscle memory.
Yes, they were conditioned by months of rigorous training to hit the dirt, identify the flash, and return fire based on those specific sensory inputs.
So it's like sensory override. You're bracing for a gunshot, and when an arrow hits the guy next to you, your brain literally doesn't have a file folder for how to process the threat.
Precisely. When an arrow strikes, there is no muzzle flash. There is no loud report giving away the shooter's position. There is only a lethal kinetic strike out of thin air.
It's invisible.
It bypasses all other modern military conditioning and taps straight into a primal ancient fear. It paralyzes the enemy with confusion. And in combat, a few seconds of confusion is deadly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
By the time they realized what was happening, Churchill was already amongst them with a sword, further shattering their cognitive framework. They surrendered because the reality of what was happening to them was too absurd and terrifying to process. They couldn't fight an enemy that didn't play by the rules of physics they understood.
He broke their brains before he broke their lines. Now, the aftermath of this skirmish is just as incredible. During the chaotic melee, Jack gets nicked in the ear by a machine gun bullet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's bleeding down the side of his neck. When his men gather around him and ask him why he didn't run when the heavy machine gun started firing, he casually wipes the blood away and mentions that he was, quote, too tired.
A statement of absolute, calculated, aristocratic nonchalance in the face of death. He refuses to show fear in front of his men.
Totally. And so the grim retreat to the coast continues. Picture the surreal visual of Jack Churchill joining the massive evacuation to Dunkirk. He's riding a salvage motorcycle toward the beaches.
With his bow.
Yep. His massive longbow is strapped tightly to the frame of the bike. Bodkin arrows are sticking haphazardly out of the leather panniers, and hanging from the headlight, swinging back and forth in the wind, is the crushed cap of the German officer he ambushed in Lepinette.
What a visual.
He eventually reaches the desperate beaches of Dunkirk, amidst the black smoke of burning oil tanks and the sunken ships and the hundreds of thousands of exhausted, defeated men. And he boards the evacuation ships, bow in hand.
He survives the fall of France. But importantly, unlike many of his peers, he does not return to England defeated or demoralized. He returns completely energized.
He loved it.
The BEF was broken, the strategy had failed, but Jack Churchill had found exactly what he was looking for. He found his war.
But surviving Dunkirk wasn't enough for him. The conventional army was still too defensive, too rigid for his tastes. He needed a unit whose entire doctrine was built on offensive audacity.
Which led him straight to Winston Churchill's newly formed commandos.
Yes. It's now 1941. Jack returns to England, and he immediately volunteers for this highly experimental, incredibly dangerous unit. Specifically, he joins No. 3 Commando.
The commandos were the brainchild of Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who, it should be noted, was of no relation to Jack, despite what the German High Command would later believe.
Right, just a coincidence.
After the disaster of Dunkirk, the Prime Minister wanted to create a force of elite, highly aggressive shock troops. Their mission was to launch devastating, amphibious hit-and-run raids on the coast of occupied Europe.
They needed crazy guys.
Exactly. They were looking for men with exceptional physical stamina, extreme initiative, and an almost unnatural appetite for danger.
So basically a recruitment poster that just said, "Wanted, Jack Churchill."
Pretty much.
It was a tailor-made fit for his brand of unconventional, highly aggressive warfare, and he quickly gets to put his theories to the ultimate test. Let's talk about Operation Archery, also known as the Mala Raid.
It is December 27th, 1941. We are in the icy, unforgiving waters off the coast of Volgsee, a rugged Norwegian island currently occupied by the Germans. It is early morning, it is pitch dark, freezing cold, and the objective is a heavily fortified German coast battery, complete with massive artillery guns and a large garrison. The British are attacking from the sea using landing craft.
I want you to put yourself in one of those landing craft. You're a young British commando. You are packed shoulder to shoulder with heavily armed men. The icy, freezing salt water of the North Sea is spraying over the metal ramp, stinging your face.
The diesel engine of the Higgins boat is roaring.
You know that at any second, the massive German coastal guns could spot you in the dark, open up, and blow your tiny craft into a million pieces. The tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife.
Terrifying.
And suddenly, shattering that awful, terrifying silence, cutting right through the hum of the diesel engines, is the wailing sound of Scottish bagpipes.
And not just any tune. He is playing the March of the Cameron Men, a fiercely aggressive Highland battle song.
Jack Churchill is standing at the absolute front of the lead landing craft, in full view of the shore, playing the bagpipes as loud as he possibly can.
Incredible.
As soon as the metal ramp drops heavily into the freezing surf, he doesn't stop playing. He steps off the ramp, wades ashore waist-deep in the freezing water at the head of 150 men. The music is screaming over the sound of incoming fire.
Just painting a target on his back.
As his boots hit the dry sand of the beach, he finally stops playing. He hurls a hand grenade at the nearest German machine gun position, draws his broadsword from its scabbard, and charges headlong into the smoke and the chaos.
And incredibly, it works.
Oh.
The sheer, terrifying audacity of the assault completely stuns the German defenders. It's exactly the psychological override we discussed earlier.
They just didn't know how to react.
The commandos successfully swarm and capture the battery, take scores of prisoners, sink several German ships in the harbor, and obliterate strategically significant docks and warehouses with explosives.
Massive success.
The strategic fallout is huge. It forces the German High Command to devote tens of thousands of troops to Norway to defend against further raids troops that desperately could have been used fighting the Soviets on the Eastern Front.
But during the fierce house-to-house fighting, Jack is injured. And this is where the historical legend of Mad Jack gets a little, well, murky, but in a way that perfectly highlights his character.
Oh, the forehead injury.
Yeah, there are two conflicting stories about what actually happened to his forehead. One official version, the one printed in the dispatches, says a British demolition charge went off too close to him, blowing him violently into a stone wall.
Which is a very standard, albeit dangerous, occupational hazard for a commando setting heavy explosives.
Right. But the other version, the one whispered by the men who were there, and the one that feels so much more perfectly him, is that during the aftermath of the raid, he had liberated a very nice bottle of Moselle wine from the German commander's personal hut to celebrate the victory. And while he's holding it, a nearby explosion violently shatters the glass bottle, sending a jagged shard of glass right into his forehead.
Regardless of whether it was C4 or Sauvignon Blanc, he is bleeding profusely from a significant head wound.
He is. And this leads to one of the most brilliant pieces of PR manipulation I've ever heard. He gets back to England to recuperate. He's hailed as a massive hero in the press. He is awarded the Military Cross for his actions.
A true hero's welcome.
But because he's in such excellent physical shape, the cut on his forehead heals really quickly. Too quickly for the newspaper photographers who keep coming around wanting to snap pictures of the rugged, wounded hero.
So what does he do?
He uses his wife Rosamund's red lipstick to touch up the scar on his forehead, making it look fresh and bloody whenever the press is around, just to keep the wounded warrior narrative going.
That is brilliant. This is almost cynical manipulation of home front morale and wartime propaganda. But on a deeper level, it speaks directly to his entire philosophy of leadership. Jack Churchill didn't just command men, he performed for them. He understood that in the utter chaos and horror of war, men follow myths just as eagerly as they follow orders.
That's a great point.
By charging off landing craft with a broadsword and bagpipes, by maintaining this almost theatrical invulnerability, he convinced his own men that absolutely nothing was impossible. If their commander could literally stroll through a heavy firefight playing a musical instrument, then surely they could take a concrete bunker.
It totally elevates the morale.
At the same time, this exact same behavior actively demoralized the enemy. It is psychological warfare executed on a deeply personal, visceral level.
He was a walking myth, and he knew how to wield that myth like a weapon. Well, let's advance the timeline to September 1943. The Allies are launching the invasion of mainland Italy. Jack is now a lieutenant colonel, and he has been given command of No. 2 Commando.
Big promotion.
The Allies land at Salerno, and it immediately turns into an absolute bloodbath. The beachhead is in crisis. The Germans are fighting ferociously, using the high ground to pin the Allies down. And out of desperation, the commandos are being used as line infantry.
Which is completely contrary to how they are designed to fight. The fighting is pushing up away from the beaches and into the steep, heavily wooded hills surrounding the bay.
Terrible terrain.
The terrain is incredibly dense, visibility is extremely poor, and the German defenders are deeply entrenched with interlocking fields of fire. A conventional daytime infantry assault up those hills would have been completely suicidal. The casualties would have been catastrophic.
So, tasked with disabling German artillery positions in the western half of the bay, Jack decides a conventional assault is out of the question. He looks at the terrain and devises a strategy that, on paper, sounds like utter madness.
As usual.
In this heavy, dark undergrowth, he organizes his commandos into 6 parallel columns. He waits until the absolute pitch black of night, and he orders a massive, coordinated charge up the hill.
Okay, stealthy.
But wait, instead of trying to be stealthy, instead of creeping through the brush, he orders every single man in those 6 columns to scream the word commando. at the absolute top of their lungs as they charge blindly through the dark.
Again, conventional military doctrine dictates that you never announce your presence during a night attack. The element of surprise is your only advantage.
But his logic made sense, right?
It was impeccably sound. First, in pitch blackness, in heavy brush, with 6 columns moving simultaneously, friendly fire is a massive, deadly risk. Shouting identifies you to the men on your left and right.
Makes total sense.
But second, and more importantly, put yourself in the boots of a German defender entrenched in that wood. You can't see anything. But from every conceivable direction in the darkness, you suddenly hear hundreds of unseen men screaming, "Commando!" and violently crashing through the underbrush towards you.
That's horrifying.
It creates the terrifying acoustic illusion that you are being surrounded by an overwhelming demonic force.
It's the 1940s equivalent of blasting heavy metal music outside a besieged compound in the middle of the night. It's total sonic dominance. It tells the enemy, we aren't hiding from you. We want you to know we are coming, and there is nothing you can do about it.
It completely shatters their nerves.
And the commando battalion wins the frantic fight and takes 136 prisoners. But that isn't even Jack's crowning achievement during the Salerno campaign. We need to zoom in on a specific night in the village of Pigoletti.
Oh, this story is incredible.
It's the middle of the night. The front lines are fluid and confusing. Jack and a single companion, a corporal named Ruffle, decide they're going to go on a little stroll past the perimeter to see if they can locate any German positions.
This is a highly dangerous reconnaissance mission. Just 2 men operating entirely behind enemy lines, surrounded by a heavily armed garrison.
They are creeping silently through the stone streets of the village in the absolute dark. Suddenly, in the pitch black, Jack spots the faint, unmistakable orange glow of a cigarette.
A scent.
Yep, it's a German sentry post. Men are quietly digging defensive trenches in the dark. Jack signals Corporal Ruffle to wait in the shadows. He silently draws his gleaming claybeg sword.
Here we go.
He creeps up, leaps out of the darkness with the heavy blade raised high over his head, and shouts, "Handa hoch!" Hands up.
The German sentries are completely stunned. The shock of a screaming British officer appearing out of thin air with a sword causes them to drop their weapons immediately.
Jack takes the lead sentry. He slips his thick braided revolver lanyard over the man's head and around his neck, effectively putting him on a leash and using him as a human shield.
Wow.
With the sharp point of his broadsword pressed firmly into the captive's back, he forces the terrified sentry to lead him from post to post through the dark village.
Just going door to door, basically.
Exactly. Here is how the mechanics of this insane raid worked. At each post, the captive would call out the password and identify himself in German. The relieving sentries would relax, thinking it was just the change of the guard, and then this terrifying British officer would leap out of the shadows, press a sword to their throats, and demand their surrender.
He is systematically, quietly dismantling the entire garrison's defensive perimeter, one foxhole at a time. He's using nothing but stealth, a medieval sword, and the enemy's own structural confusion against them.
It's wild. By the end of the night, Jack Churchill and Corporal Ruffle, 2 men, have captured 42 German soldiers. 42.
And a mortar crew.
Yes, they also capture an entire 81mm mortar crew. But the way he brings these prisoners back to the British lines is so incredibly pragmatic and frankly so insulting to the Germans.
It really is.
He forces his prisoners to load their own heavy mortar tube, all their heavy explosive bombs, and their own wounded men into a large wooden farm cart. Then he systematically pulls the metal bolts out of all 42 captured Mauser rifles, throws the bolts into a canvas sack, hands the heavy sack to one of the prisoners to carry, and forces the disarmed Germans to pull the cart back to the British camp themselves.
It is an absolute masterclass in exploiting an enemy's rigid training and doctrine. When Jack was later asked by astounded superior officers how on earth 2 men managed to capture and march back 42 armed soldiers, he gave an incredibly insightful quote.
What was it?
He said, "I maintain that as long as you tell a German loudly and clearly what to do, if you are senior to him, he will cry jawohl and get on with it enthusiastically and efficiently, whatever the situation."
He weaponized their own strict discipline against them.
Precisely. The German military apparatus, especially the Wehrmacht, was built heavily on strict hierarchy and unquestioning obedience to authority. While they utilized off-truck mission-type tactics allowing for lower-level initiative, the base conditioning of the average infantryman was strict obedience.
So they just followed the loudest voice.
Jack realized a profound psychological truth. if he presented himself as an overwhelming, unhesitating authority figure. Even if he was wearing an enemy uniform, the lower-ranking soldiers' default conditioning would often kick in under extreme stress. Their brains defaulted to obedience. He turned their greatest structural strength into a paralyzing weakness.
That is just brilliant psychological hacking. But as we follow his career into 1944, we see that Jack's incredible luck couldn't hold out forever. The war is getting darker and the stakes are getting higher.
Yes, his deployment to Yugoslavia.
Jack is now operating in Yugoslavia. He is coordinating with Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans, launching raids from the Adriatic Islands to harass the German supply lines. In May 1944, a massive joint assault is planned on a heavily fortified, mined mountain peak on the island of Brock. This objective is known as Hill 622.
And this was a formidable, arguably suicidal objective. The approaches up the hillside were completely devoid of cover. They were choked with barbed wire and extensive minefields. The German defenders were deeply entrenched at the summit, with clear, pre-sighted lines of fire for their heavy artillery and 81mm mortars.
It was an incredibly tough nut to crack. It's a night assault, but there is bright moonlight, eliminating any real stealth. Jack leads 40 Commando, Royal Marines alongside the partisans up the rocky hill.
And of course, playing the bagpipes.
True to his established mythos, he is playing his bagpipes to lead the charge. But this time, the element of surprise is completely gone. The Germans see them coming, and they open up with everything they have. The Royal Marines are getting absolutely torn apart by mortars and heavy machine gun fire. This isn't a glorious adventure. Men are dying violently all around him on the slopes of this barren mountain.
The casualties are horrific. But despite the withering fire, Jack and a small, determined group of his commandos actually managed to push through the minefields, overrun the leading German positions, and reach the summit of Hill 622.
They made it to the top.
They did, however. The partisan support on their flanks fails to materialize, and they find themselves completely cut off and surrounded by counterattacking Germans.
Eventually, the battle whittles down to just Jack and 6 surviving men huddled in a rocky depression on the top of Hill 622. A German mortar shell lands directly in their position, and 3 of those 6 men are instantly killed. The others are bleeding and badly wounded.
It's a desperate situation.
Jack realizes he is completely out of revolver ammunition. He is standing there in the moonlight holding an empty American M1 carbine. The Germans are closing in from all sides, throwing stick grenades, and what does he do?
Fellas.
He slings the empty rifle over his shoulder, he picks up his bagpipes, and as the grenades are raining down around him, kicking up dirt and shrapnel, he starts playing the mournful Scottish lament, "Will ye no come back again?"
Unbelievable.
He plays the pipes loudly into the night until a German grenade explodes right next to him, and a piece of shrapnel strikes him in the head, knocking him completely unconscious.
It is a devastating, tragic scene, but it forces us to critically analyze his decision-making process here.
Right, I have to ask, at what point does bravery cross the line into a suicide mission? I mean, why didn't he order a retreat? He was out of ammo, surrounded, and the men he was responsible for were dead or dying. Why stand there playing a song while grenades are being thrown at you?
It is a vital question. From a strictly tactical perspective, a fighting retreat might have been the logical choice, assuming a retreat was even physically possible down a heavily mined hillside under intense machine gun fire, which is doubtful.
True.
But we have to look at this moment strictly through the lens of Jack Churchill's deeply ingrained personal philosophy. For a man who treated his life like an epic Arthurian poem, surrendering while conscious was simply not an option.
It would ruin the myth.
Exactly. His entire persona, the invincible myth he had carefully constructed to lead his men, demanded that he go down fighting, or in this case, playing. To drop his weapons and raise his hands in surrender would have fundamentally betrayed the core of who he believed himself to be. The myth he created demanded the pipes. It demanded defiance to the absolute last breath.
He was a prisoner to his own legend,
Yeah.
and remarkably, he survives the blast. He wakes up hours later to German soldiers physically prodding him with their rifles to see if he's alive.
That had to be a rude awakening.
Very. Now, the German captain who captures him, a man named Hans Thorner, is faced with a choice. Hitler had issued the infamous commando order, a directive to immediately execute all captured Allied commandos, as they were considered saboteurs outside the rules of war.
But Thorner disobeys that order.
He does. He treats Jack with military respect and takes him prisoner. And in a wonderfully absurd twist that perfectly highlights Jack's bizarre aristocratic politeness, Jack actually writes Captain Thorner a formal thank you note for his hospitality before being shipped off to a POW camp.
And that seemingly flippant gesture had massive historical consequences. That polite note incredibly saved Captain Thorner's life after the war.
Wait, really?
Yes. When Thorner was captured by Yugoslav forces and faced summary execution as a war criminal, he produced Jack Churchill's handwritten letter to prove he had treated Allied prisoners humanely. It saved him from the firing squad.
That is wild. The butterfly effect of a polite thank you note in a war zone. But Jack's time as a prisoner of war is just as chaotic and defiant as his combat record. Because his last name is Churchill, the German High Command is absolutely convinced he is a direct blood relative of Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
Which is so funny.
They think they've captured British royalty. They fly him to Berlin for special interrogation, and then they lock him up in the infamous Sachsenhausen concentration camp, placing him in a special, highly guarded compound for high-profile political prisoners.
Which, if you understand the psychology of Jack Churchill, is the worst possible place you could put him. Locking him in a static environment is a guarantee that he will dedicate every waking second of his immense energy to breaking out.
He immediately teams up with a Royal Air Force officer named Jimmy James. And Jimmy James is not just any downed pilot. He is a veteran of the actual historical Great Escape from Stalag Luft III.
These guys are professional escape artists.
Totally. Together, under the noses of the SS guards, they spend weeks painstakingly digging a secret tunnel under the camp's barbed wire perimeter. In September 1944, they break out. They emerge outside the wire and make a desperate run for the Baltic coast, aiming for the port town of Rostock, where they hope to stow away on a neutral Swedish ship.
They almost make it too. They travel for days. But the German environment is heavily patrolled by the Gestapo and the Home Guard, and they are eventually spotted, recaptured just short of the coast, and sent to an even more secure, heavily guarded camp in Austria.
But you cannot keep Mad Jack in a box. It's April 1945. The war is clearly winding down, the Third Reich is collapsing, but Jack isn't going to sit around waiting for Allied tanks to liberate him. One night, the floodlights illuminating the Austrian camp suddenly fail. The perimeter goes pitch black.
Perfect timing.
Jack doesn't hesitate for a single second. He just drops the shovel he's holding on his work detail and walks calmly away into the darkness. He melts into the Austrian night.
And this impulsive decision begins one of the most grueling physical endurance feats of his entire life. He looks at the geography and decides he is going to walk from Austria to Italy to find the advancing American armies.
Think about the physical reality of this. He undertakes an incredible 150-mile trek across the unforgiving terrain of the Alps, and he does it on a severely sprained ankle.
Oh, that's brutal.
If you've ever rolled an ankle on a light hike, you know the blinding pain. Now scale that up to climbing freezing alpine passes while starting and hiding from military patrols. He stays off the roads, hiking through the freezing mountains.
Yeah, what did he eat?
His only survival gear is a rusty tin can he found and hid in his jacket, and a few stolen matches. He survives by creeping into Austrian farms at night, stealing raw vegetables from gardens, and boiling them in this rusty tin over tiny hidden fires in the woods.
That is true survival.
After 8 agonizing days of this, hobbling on a busted, swollen ankle, he looks down into a valley and spots a massive armored column on a road far below. He squints and sees the white star of the United States Army painted on the turrets.
He made it.
He limps down the mountain, walks right up to the tank crew looking like an absolute vagrant, starved, filthy in rags, and gives them a crisp, perfect Sandhurst military salute.
It's the perfect cinematic ending to his European war. He escaped, he survived the elements, and he found his way back to friendly lines. But for Jack, the end of the war in Europe is not a cause for celebration. It is a profound disappointment.
Which brings us to the final phase of his military career. Because while everyone else in Europe is popping champagne, kissing in Times Square, and crying tears of joy that the 6-year nightmare is finally over, Jack Churchill is furious.
You felt cheated.
He's missed a whole year of frontline fighting while he was stuck in those POW camps, so he immediately demands to be deployed to the Pacific Theater. He rushes to Burma, ready to fight the Japanese in the brutal jungle terrain. He arrives in India, he's packing his gear, he's ready to go, and then the United States drops the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan unconditionally surrenders.
The defining global conflict of his generation is suddenly and permanently over.
And Jack utters a quote that perfectly, hilariously encapsulates his mind-boggling worldview. Standing in India, realizing the war is over, he complains to a fellow officer. "If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going for another 10 years.
That statement really highlights the massive psychological disconnect between Churchill and the average enlisted soldier. The average soldier was traumatized and desperately wanted to go home to their families. Churchill wanted the crusade to continue indefinitely. Peace, for him, was a stifling enemy.
But because he is Jack Churchill, he finds a way to keep the adrenaline pumping. In 1948, he's serving as a conventional officer with the Highland Light Infantry in Palestine during the final, incredibly volatile and violent months of the British Mandate.
A very dangerous place to be.
Jewish and Arab forces are in open, brutal conflict in the streets. And we get one last incredible military exploit that shows a different side of his tactical brilliance. It's April 13th, 1948, the tragic Hadassah medical convoy massacre.
It is a horrifying situation. A convoy of civilian Jewish doctors, nurses, and patients heading to the hospital is ambushed by Arab fighters in a narrow bottleneck street in Jerusalem. Vehicles are burning, civilians are trapped inside armored buses under heavy fire, and the British military forces stationed nearby are under strict political orders not to intervene and escalate the conflict.
But Jack Churchill doesn't care about political orders when a massacre is happening in front of him. He rushes to the area in a small armored car. He radios for heavy backup, but he knows it will take too long to arrive. The people in the buses are dying.
So he takes matters into his own hands.
He leaves the safety of his armored escort. He steps out onto the bullet-swept road completely alone, and he is in full formal Scottish military dress kilt, Glengarry bonnet, the works. He has no broadsword this time. He isn't even carrying a gun.
Just walking out there.
He is carrying a simple wooden blackthorn walking stick. And he has a massive, beaming smile plastered on his face. He walks right into the middle of the lethal crossfire.
And miraculously, the heavy firing slackens. He calmly makes his way to the trapped buses, bangs on the metal doors with his wooden stick, and offers to evacuate the terrified occupants.
Now, out of confusion and fear, they initially refuse his help, believing that Jewish paramilitary forces will arrive shortly to save them. Tragically, those rescue forces are delayed, and many people in the convoy are killed in the ensuing firefight.
Just an awful situation.
But Jack doesn't give up. He survives the street ambush and later coordinates the highly dangerous, incredibly complex evacuation of 700 patients and staff from the Hadassah hospital itself, personally saving hundreds of civilian lives.
That's incredible.
So we have to ask the psychological question. How did he walk into a raging ambush with a wooden stick and not get shot to pieces? Jack explained his logic later in life. He said, "People are less likely to shoot you if you smile at them."
It's a profound, almost incredibly simple statement on human psychology under extreme stress. In a moment of high tension, rage, and fear, a man walking calmly through a kill zone with a smile completely disrupted the attacker's expectations.
It's that disruption again.
Exactly. It confused their brains just long enough to stay their trigger fingers. It was the exact same psychological disruption, the same sensory override that he used with the longbow and the bagpipes, just channeled through a completely nonviolent medium. He controlled the battlefield by refusing to act like a target.
Disruption through sheer audacity. Now, eventually, Jack Churchill has to age out and retire from active combat, but the transition to civilian life doesn't slow him down. He just remains a profoundly eccentric individual. I mean, how do you follow up a career of fighting Nazis with a broadsword?
You continuously seek out new thrills and master new skills. At the age of 40, the time when most military men are settling into comfortable desk jobs or civilian retirement, he decides he needs to qualify as a military paratrooper, making his first terrifying jump out of an airplane on his 40th birthday.
Of course he does.
Later, when he's posted to Australia as a military instructor, he discovers the sport of surfing. He becomes obsessed. He brings custom surfboards back to England and actually becomes the very first person in recorded history to surf the 5-foot tidal bore of the River Severn.
He's just conquering everything.
In his quieter moments, he spends his time refurbishing old steamboats on the Thames and meticulously building complex, radio-controlled model warships. He was a man constantly seeking mastery over new, difficult environments.
But my absolute favorite post-war story, the anecdote that I think perfectly encapsulates the brilliant method to his madness, is the story of the briefcase toss.
Oh, this is great.
In his later years, Jack is working a desk job in London for the Ministry of Defense. Like thousands of other men, he takes the commuter train home to Surrey every evening. And regularly, as the train is speeding through the quiet suburbs in the dark, Jack would suddenly stand up in the carriage, calmly open the train window, and hurl his heavy, official-looking ministry briefcase out into the blackness of the night.
And the other commuters in the carriage would be absolutely horrified.
They thought he was having a psychotic break or maybe destroying highly classified state secrets.
To a normal observer, it looked like sheer lunacy. But there was a completely logical, highly pragmatic reason behind the action.
Exactly. The train tracks ran directly behind the garden of his house in Surrey. He was perfectly timing the throw to hurl his briefcase into his own backyard so he wouldn't have to carry the heavy bag from the train station all the way to his home. It's brilliant.
It perfectly captures the essence of John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. To the outside observer, his actions, whether it's throwing a briefcase out a window or carrying a longbow into a mechanized war, appear entirely mad.
Right.
But internally, he possessed a rigorous, highly practical logic. He simply didn't care about societal conventions, military norms, or the expectations of others if a more direct, efficient, or entertaining path was available to him.
He lived entirely by his own rules. And as we bring this deep dive to a close, looking back at the sweeping, unbelievable life of Mad Jack Churchill, it is genuinely hard to reconcile a man with the era he lived in.
It really is.
We started this discussion by picturing the mechanized industrial horror of World War II. The mud, the tanks, the factory-scale slaughter. And navigating through all of that blood and steel was a man who approached the war not as a modern anonymous soldier, but as a highly visible medieval knight-errant.
And what we must take away from his incredible story is that Jack's survival through the retreat at Dunkirk, the bloody hills of Salerno, the slaughter in Yugoslavia, and the desperate POW escapes wasn't just blind luck.
No, it wasn't.
Yes, fortune favors the bold, but Jack's absolute, unwavering lack of fear actively broke the cognitive framework of his enemies. He survived because he refused to play by the established rules of modern warfare. He fought on a psychological plane that his adversaries didn't even know existed.
He brought a sword to a gunfight and thoroughly convinced the guys with the guns to surrender. It's a testament to the sheer force of human personality. So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering question to mull over.
Something to really think about.
Think about the way wars are fought today. In our highly sanitized, hyper-modern world of unmanned drone strikes, satellite surveillance, over-the-horizon missiles, and algorithmic warfare, is there any room left on the battlefield for a Mad Jack Churchill? Or was he truly the very last of a dying breed? The final warrior in human history who could step into the mud and the machine gun fire and single-handedly bend the terrifying industrialized reality of war to his own personal mythology.
It's a fascinating thought.
Something to think about as you go about your day.